What kind of teacher should never be allowed near children? I found the recordings on my daughter's tablet while helping her with homework. Olivia had left it on the kitchen table, and the screen was still unlocked when I picked it up to move it aside. A video file was paused mid-frame, showing her classroom at Riverside Elementary. I recognized the room immediately from parent-teacher conferences. What I didn't recognize was the audio playing through the speakers when I accidentally hit play. Mr. Brennan's voice came through crystal clear, telling my 11-year-old daughter she was special and different from other students. The way he said it made my stomach turn over. I kept listening and heard him say things no teacher should ever say to a child. He told her she was mature for her age and understood things other kids couldn't grasp yet. He said they had a connection that was unique and private. I sat down hard in the kitchen chair and felt my hands start shaking. The video showed nothing inappropriate visually, just a normal classroom during what looked like lunch period. But the audio was clearly from a different time, a private conversation recorded somehow without video. Olivia's voice responded to Mr. Brennan's comments with uncomfortable laughter and one-word answers. She sounded nervous and confused. He kept pushing, asking if she'd thought about their last conversation and reminding her how important it was to keep their talks private. He said other people wouldn't understand their special relationship and might try to ruin it. My daughter's voice got quieter with each response until she was barely audible. I checked the file properties and saw it had been created 3 days ago. There were 6 more audio files in the same folder, all labeled with dates going back 2 months. I played the second one and heard Mr. Brennan telling Olivia she looked pretty in her new shirt and asking if she'd worn it specifically for him. He talked about how he noticed everything about her because she mattered to him more than his other students. Olivia tried to redirect the conversation to homework, but he kept steering it back to personal topics. He asked about her home life and whether her parents paid enough attention to her. He suggested maybe she needed someone who really understood her the way he did. The third recording was worse. Mr. Brennan asked Olivia to stay after class to help him organize supplies, but once the other students left, his tone changed completely. He told her she was becoming a beautiful young woman, and he felt lucky to be able to watch her grow up. He said most men wouldn't appreciate her the way he did because they couldn't see past her age to the person she really was inside. Olivia's breathing got faster on the recording, and she asked if she could go to her next class. He said in a minute that he just wanted to enjoy her company a little longer. He asked if she ever thought about him outside of school, and seemed disappointed when she said no. I called my wife at work and told her to come home immediately. When she asked what was wrong, I couldn't even explain it over the phone. I just said it was about Olivia and school, and she needed to hear it herself. Rachel got home in 20 minutes and found me still sitting at the kitchen table with the tablet in front of me. I played her the first recording without any explanation. I watched her face go from confused to horrified as she listened to Mr. Brennan's voice talking to our daughter. Rachel grabbed the tablet and started going through all the files. We listened to each one together in complete silence except for the recordings playing. The fourth file contained Mr. Brennan asking Olivia if she'd ever had a boyfriend, and then telling her that boys her age were immature and wouldn't know how to treat someone like her properly. He said when she was older, she'd understand what it meant to have a real connection with someone. He asked if she trusted him, and when she hesitated, he reminded her of all the times he'd helped her with difficult assignments and given her special attention. He said trust was the foundation of their relationship, and without it, he might not be able to continue giving her that extra support she needed. Olivia quickly said she trusted him, and he seemed satisfied. The fifth recording made Rachel cry. Mr. Brennan told Olivia she had a mature beauty that most girls her age didn't possess yet. He said he'd been teaching for 15 years and rarely encountered a student who affected him the way she did. He talked about how hard it was to maintain professional boundaries when he felt such a strong connection to someone. Olivia didn't respond, and he asked if he'd made her uncomfortable. She said no in a small voice, and he told her good, that he never wanted her to feel uncomfortable around him. He said they should keep having these private talks so they could develop their friendship without interference from people who wouldn't understand. The sixth recording was from just yesterday. Mr. Brennan asked Olivia to meet him in his classroom during lunch to discuss an upcoming project. When she arrived, he locked the door behind her and said he didn't want to be interrupted. He told her he'd been thinking about her all weekend and missed seeing her. He asked if she'd thought about him too, and when she didn't answer immediately, his tone shifted to something harder. He reminded her that her grades had improved significantly since they'd started their special talks, and that he'd given her opportunities other students didn't get. He said it would be unfortunate if she stopped appreciating everything he did for her. Rachel and I stared at each other across the kitchen table in complete shock. Our daughter had been recording these conversations somehow, documenting this teacher's predatory behavior for 2 months. I checked Olivia's room and found her in bed even though it was only 7 in the evening. She looked up when I came in and her face went pale. She saw the tablet in my hand and immediately started crying. I sat down on her bed and told her she wasn't in trouble, but we needed to talk about Mr. Brennan. She shook her head violently and said she didn't want to talk about it. Rachel came in and sat on her other side, and we both promised her she was safe and nothing bad would happen to her. Olivia finally started talking through her tears. She said Mr. Brennan started giving her extra attention at the beginning of the school year. At first it seemed nice because he helped her with math, which was her worst subject. But then he started keeping her after class for reasons that didn't make sense. He'd find excuses to be alone with her and would say things that made her uncomfortable. She didn't know how to tell us, because he kept saying their conversations were private and special. He said if she told anyone, people would misunderstand, and he might get in trouble for just trying to be a good teacher. He made her feel responsible for protecting him. She explained that she'd started recording their conversations on her tablet after he touched her shoulder in a way that felt wrong. She'd been scared and didn't know what to do, but thought if she had proof, someone would believe her if things got worse. Mr. Brennan had never done anything beyond inappropriate talking and occasional shoulder or arm touches, but Olivia felt like he was building up to something more. She was terrified to be alone with him, but also afraid that if she refused his requests, he'd retaliate by hurting her grades or telling people she was a problem student. She felt completely trapped. I felt rage building in my chest that made it hard to breathe normally. This teacher had been grooming my daughter for months, isolating her and manipulating her into keeping secrets. He'd used his position of authority to make her feel responsible for his behavior and scared of the consequences if she spoke up. I told Olivia she'd done exactly the right thing by recording these conversations and that we were going to make sure Mr. Brennan never did this to anyone else. Rachel held Olivia while she cried and promised her over and over that none of this was her fault and she was incredibly brave. We called the police that night and 2 officers came to our house around 9. I played them the recordings on Olivia's tablet and watched their expressions change from professional neutrality to obvious disgust. The female officer, Detective Winters, asked Olivia gentle questions about her interactions with Mr. Brennan. Olivia described how he'd started with compliments and extra help, then gradually shifted to more personal conversations. She said he always locked his classroom door when they were alone and positioned himself between her and the exit. He never explicitly threatened her, but made it clear her academic success depended on maintaining their special relationship. Detective Winters explained that Mr. Brennan's behavior constituted child grooming and emotional abuse. Even though he hadn't physically assaulted Olivia, his actions showed clear predatory patterns designed to break down boundaries and normalize inappropriate attention. The recordings provided strong evidence of his intentions and methods. She said they'd need to interview Olivia formally at the station with a child advocate present and that we should keep her home from school tomorrow. The police would be contacting the school administration and likely executing a search warrant on Mr. Brennan's classroom and personal devices. Detective Winters warned us that once the investigation became public, things might get complicated. I barely slept that night thinking about this predator having access to my daughter every day. I thought about all the times I'd thanked him at parent-teacher conferences for taking such an interest in Olivia's education. He'd seemed like a dedicated teacher who genuinely cared about his students. Now I realized every interaction had been a performance designed to gain trust while he groomed my child. I felt sick, thinking about how many opportunities he'd had to be alone with her and how close things had come to escalating beyond psychological manipulation. If Olivia hadn't been brave enough to start recording, we might never have known until something terrible happened. The next morning, we took Olivia to the police station, where she gave a formal video statement to Detective Winters and another investigator. They asked detailed questions about every interaction with Mr. Brennan, when they'd started, how they'd progressed, and whether she'd witnessed him behaving similarly with other students. Olivia mentioned that Mr. Brennan seemed to favor several other girls in class, keeping them after school for extra help and giving them special attention. She remembered 3 names specifically: Zoe, Brittany, and Madison. All 3 were around the same age as Olivia and had similar physical characteristics. Detective Winters made notes about the other potential victims and said they'd be conducting interviews with those families as well. She explained that predators often had multiple targets and that the pattern Olivia described suggested Mr. Brennan had been doing this for a while. The investigation would examine his entire teaching history, looking for complaints or concerns that might have been dismissed or ignored. She warned us that we might discover he'd been victimizing children for years with the school administration failing to take action. That possibility made me want to drive to Riverside Elementary and drag Mr. Brennan out of his classroom myself. The school principal called my cell phone that afternoon, sounding nervous and defensive. Mrs. Hughes said the police had contacted her about allegations against Mr. Brennan, and she wanted to assure us the school took such matters very seriously. She said Mr. Brennan had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation and would have no further contact with students. I asked her directly if there had been any previous complaints about him, and she hesitated too long before saying no. That hesitation told me everything. I said we'd be speaking with a lawyer about the school's liability, and she immediately started backtracking, saying she couldn't discuss personnel matters, but the district would cooperate fully with law enforcement. Rachel found an attorney who specialized in cases involving child predators and institutional failures. Jonathan Pierce had successfully sued several school districts for negligence in protecting students from abusive teachers. He agreed to meet with us that evening after reviewing the recordings. When we arrived at his office, he looked angry before we even started talking. He said the audio files showed textbook grooming behavior and that Olivia's recordings would be crucial evidence. He asked about our interactions with the school and whether they'd given any indication of prior knowledge about Mr. Brennan's behavior. I told him about Mrs. Hughes's hesitation when I asked about previous complaints. Jonathan explained that schools often received warnings about predatory teachers, but failed to act decisively because they feared lawsuits or bad publicity. Teachers' unions made it difficult to fire someone without overwhelming evidence, so administrators would sometimes transfer problem teachers to different schools rather than address the issue properly. He said he'd be requesting all of Mr. Brennan's personnel files and any complaints filed against him during his 15-year career. He predicted we'd find a pattern of concerning behavior that the school district had ignored or covered up. Jonathan said our case was strong and we'd likely discover other victims once the investigation became public. The story broke on local news 2 days later. A reporter had obtained information about Mr. Brennan's arrest and ran a piece about the veteran teacher being investigated for child grooming at Riverside Elementary. The school's phone lines were immediately overwhelmed with calls from concerned parents demanding to know if their children were safe. Mrs. Hughes sent an email to all families, assuring them that student safety was the top priority and that the district was cooperating with law enforcement. The email carefully avoided any admission of prior knowledge or responsibility. It made me furious reading her carefully worded non-apology that protected the school while saying nothing of substance. 3 more families came forward within a week. Zoe's parents found inappropriate messages on her phone from a number she said belonged to Mr. Brennan. He'd been texting her outside of school hours asking about her day and sending her compliments about her appearance and personality. Brittany's mother discovered emails where Mr. Brennan praised her daughter's maturity and suggested they should spend more time together. Madison's father reported that his daughter had become withdrawn and anxious about going to school, but wouldn't explain why. When he mentioned Mr. Brennan's name after seeing the news, Madison broke down crying and admitted he'd been making her uncomfortable for months. Detective Winters called to tell me that the search of Mr. Brennan's classroom and home computers had revealed extensive files on multiple students. He'd kept photographs of girls in his classes going back years, along with detailed notes about their personalities, interests, and family situations. He'd saved copies of essays and assignments, but only from specific female students who matched a particular physical type. His internet history showed searches related to grooming techniques and legal age of consent laws in different states. His personal journal contained explicit fantasies about former students and detailed plans for developing relationships with current ones. The investigation expanded to include Mr. Brennan's previous teaching positions. He'd worked at 3 different schools before Riverside Elementary, and each time he'd left under circumstances that now seemed suspicious. At his first school, parents had complained about him giving excessive attention to certain female students, but the administration had dismissed the concerns as overprotective paranoia. At his second school, he'd been informally warned about maintaining appropriate boundaries, but was allowed to resign quietly when he accepted a position elsewhere. At his third school, a formal complaint had been filed, but was withdrawn after the family was pressured by school officials who claimed it would damage the girl's reputation. Jonathan filed a lawsuit against the school district on behalf of our family and the 3 other families who'd come forward. The complaint alleged that Riverside Elementary and the district administration had failed to protect students from a known predator. We argued that the pattern of complaints at previous schools should have triggered background checks and closer supervision. Instead, the district had hired Mr. Brennan without adequately vetting his history and had ignored warning signs that parents had reported. The lawsuit sought damages for emotional trauma and demanded policy changes to prevent similar failures in the future. The district's lawyers tried to argue that they'd had no way of knowing about Mr. Brennan's predatory behavior because previous complaints hadn't been formally documented. Jonathan destroyed that argument by producing records showing the district had contacted Mr. Brennan's previous employers during the hiring process. References from those schools had been suspiciously vague, using careful language that suggested problems without explicitly stating them. A competent human resources department would have recognized the red flags and conducted deeper investigations. The district had been negligent at best and deliberately ignorant at worst. Olivia started therapy twice a week with a counselor who specialized in helping children recover from grooming and abuse. The therapist explained that even though Mr. Brennan hadn't physically assaulted Olivia, the psychological manipulation had caused real trauma. Olivia struggled with guilt and self-blame, feeling she should have told us sooner or been smart enough to recognize what was happening. The therapist worked on helping her understand that adults in positions of authority are skilled manipulators, and that children aren't responsible for protecting themselves from predatory behavior by people they're supposed to trust. Mr. Brennan's criminal trial started 8 months after his arrest. The prosecution charged him with multiple counts of child endangerment, attempted grooming, and communication with a minor for immoral purposes. They played Olivia's recordings in court and presented evidence from the other victims showing a clear pattern of predatory behavior. Mr. Brennan's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had been misunderstood and was simply a caring teacher who'd formed close mentoring relationships with students. The prosecutor destroyed that argument by highlighting the secret nature of the conversations, the isolation tactics, and the sexual undertones in his communications. Multiple experts testified about grooming patterns and how Mr. Brennan's behavior fit the classic model of a child predator. A forensic psychologist explained how predators select vulnerable targets, build trust through special attention, gradually introduce inappropriate content, and use fear and obligation to maintain secrecy. Every step of Mr. Brennan's interactions with Olivia and the other girls matched this pattern precisely. The expert testified that based on the evidence, Mr. Brennan had been in the process of grooming multiple victims simultaneously and would likely have escalated to physical assault if he hadn't been caught. Olivia had to testify during the trial, despite our efforts to shield her from that trauma. She sat in the witness box looking small and scared, while the prosecutor asked her to describe her interactions with Mr. Brennan. She spoke quietly but clearly about how uncomfortable he'd made her feel and how scared she'd been to tell anyone. When the defense attorney cross-examined her, he tried to suggest she'd misinterpreted normal teacher concern as something inappropriate. Olivia looked him in the eye and said that normal teachers don't lock doors or talk about how pretty students are or make them feel responsible for keeping secrets. The jury looked disgusted by the defense's tactics. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Mr. Brennan guilty on all counts. The judge scheduled sentencing for a month later, and Mr. Brennan was remanded to custody immediately. As he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he looked at Olivia with an expression of pure hatred. I moved to block his line of sight and felt Rachel's hand grip my arm hard enough to hurt. The bailiff hurried Mr. Brennan out a side door before anyone could say or do anything they'd regret. Detective Winters told us later that Mr. Brennan had been completely unrepentant during his arrest and interrogation, maintaining that he'd done nothing wrong and that everyone was overreacting. At sentencing, the judge allowed victim impact statements. Rachel and I spoke about how Mr. Brennan's actions had shattered our trust in the school system and stolen our daughter's sense of safety. Olivia's statement was read by the prosecutor because she couldn't face Mr. Brennan again. In it, she described having nightmares about being trapped in his classroom and feeling like she'd never be able to trust teachers again. The other victims' families gave similar statements about broken trust, ongoing therapy, and children who were now afraid to attend school. The judge listened to everything with a grim expression. When it was time for sentencing, the judge addressed Mr. Brennan directly. He said that teachers hold positions of sacred trust and that violating that trust by preying on vulnerable children was among the most despicable crimes possible. He noted that Mr. Brennan had shown no remorse and had actually tried to blame his victims for misunderstanding his intentions. The judge said the evidence showed Mr. Brennan was a calculated predator who'd spent years perfecting his methods and victimizing children. He sentenced Mr. Brennan to 15 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. He also imposed a lifetime ban on working with children in any capacity and mandatory registration as a sex offender upon release. The lawsuit against the school district went to trial 6 months after the criminal conviction. Jonathan presented evidence showing that the district had received multiple warnings about Mr. Brennan's inappropriate behavior with students. Former administrators testified that they'd been pressured by district officials to minimize complaints and avoid creating paper trails that might expose the district to liability. One former principal admitted she'd been told to handle a complaint about Mr. Brennan quietly and not to document it officially. She said she'd been warned that too much documentation could be used against the district in future lawsuits. The district's defense crumbled under the weight of evidence showing systematic failures to protect students. Internal emails revealed that administrators knew Mr. Brennan had concerning interactions with female students, but chose to monitor him informally rather than take decisive action. They'd gambled that nothing serious would happen and had lost that gamble at the expense of multiple children's well-being. The jury found the district liable for negligence and awarded significant damages to all 4 families. More importantly, the verdict forced the district to implement comprehensive reforms including mandatory reporting training, background check protocols, and independent review of complaints. Olivia's healing process was slow and non-linear. Some weeks she seemed back to her normal self, laughing with friends and excited about school activities. Other weeks she'd regress into anxiety and withdrawal, particularly around male authority figures. Her therapist said this was completely normal and that recovering from betrayal by a trusted adult took time. The important thing was that Olivia knew she was believed and supported, and that what happened wasn't her fault. The therapist said many victims of grooming carry shame and guilt for years because people question why they didn't speak up sooner or resist more actively. Olivia had the advantage of family support and validation that many victims never receive. Rachel and I became advocates for stronger protections against predatory teachers. We worked with a state legislator to draft new laws requiring thorough background investigations for all teaching applicants, including direct contact with former employers. The law mandated that schools document all complaints about inappropriate conduct and make those records available to other districts during the hiring process. We pushed for harsher penalties for administrators who failed to report suspected grooming or abuse. The legislation passed with overwhelming support and was named after Olivia, though we kept her last name private to protect her identity. 2 years after Mr. Brennan's conviction, Olivia started 8th grade at a different school. She'd grown taller and more confident, though the experience with Mr. Brennan had left permanent marks. She'd become an advocate herself, speaking to parent groups about recognizing warning signs of predatory behavior. She explained how teachers who isolate students, request private communications, or make children feel responsible for keeping secrets are displaying major red flags. She emphasized that children often don't recognize grooming while it's happening because predators are skilled at making inappropriate attention feel special and normal. The other 3 victims had varied recovery trajectories. Zoe struggled with trust issues and changed schools twice before finding an environment where she felt safe. Brittany developed anxiety that required medication and ongoing therapy. Madison seemed to bounce back relatively quickly, but her parents worried she was suppressing trauma that might resurface later. All 4 families stayed in contact and formed a support network. We shared resources about therapy options and legal rights. We warned each other when Mr. Brennan would be up for parole in future years, so we could attend hearings and ensure he stayed incarcerated as long as possible. Detective Winters contacted me 3 years after the initial investigation. She said a woman in her 30s had come forward claiming Mr. Brennan had groomed and assaulted her when she was his student 15 years ago. The woman had been following news coverage of his trial and conviction and finally felt brave enough to speak up. She described experiencing the same pattern of special attention, isolation, and inappropriate conversations that Olivia had documented. In her case, Mr. Brennan had escalated to physical assault during her 8th grade year. She'd never told anyone because he'd convinced her it was consensual and that she'd get in trouble if anyone found out. This revelation prompted authorities to reopen investigations at all of Mr. Brennan's previous schools. They identified 6 additional victims over his 15-year teaching career. Each one described similar grooming tactics, followed by progressively more serious boundary violations. Some had experienced only inappropriate conversations and touching. Others reported sexual assault that had occurred in classrooms after school or during field trips. None had reported the abuse at the time because Mr. Brennan had been skilled at making them feel complicit and responsible. The pattern was sickening in its consistency. Prosecutors filed new charges against Mr. Brennan for the assaults on adult victims who could now testify about crimes committed when they were minors. He was already serving his 15-year sentence, but these additional charges would extend his incarceration significantly. More importantly, they validated the experiences of victims who'd been carrying shame and trauma for decades. Several of the adult victims attended the new trial and found some measure of closure in seeing Mr. Brennan held accountable for what he'd done to them. The judge added another 20 years to his sentence to run consecutively with the original conviction. Olivia attended college and decided to study psychology with a focus on child development and trauma. She said the experience with Mr. Brennan had shaped her understanding of how predators exploit power dynamics and how important early intervention is. She wanted to work with children who'd experienced abuse and help them process trauma in healthy ways. She also planned to consult with schools on creating safer environments and training staff to recognize grooming behaviors. She'd turned her worst experience into a driving force for protecting other children. Rachel and I testified before the State Board of Education about gaps in teacher oversight and accountability. We argued that the current system allowed predators to move between districts without consequence because schools were more concerned with avoiding lawsuits than protecting students. We pushed for a centralized database of complaints and investigations that all districts could access during hiring. We advocated for mandatory reporter training that explicitly covered grooming behaviors, not just physical abuse. We demanded consequences for administrators who failed to act on red flags or who pressured families to withdraw complaints. The reforms we fought for were gradually implemented across the state. Districts began conducting more thorough background checks and following up on concerning reference letters. Mandatory reporting training expanded to cover psychological manipulation and grooming. Schools created protocols for investigating complaints that protected both the rights of accused teachers and the safety of students. Parent education programs taught families how to recognize warning signs and encouraged open communication with children about interactions with authority figures. None of these changes brought back the innocence Mr. Brennan had stolen, but they might prevent other predators from finding similar opportunities. The psychological toll on our family was significant and lasting. Rachel developed anxiety about Olivia's safety that bordered on overprotective. She insisted on knowing where Olivia was at all times and struggled to let her participate in normal teenage activities. Our marriage strained under the weight of shared trauma and different coping mechanisms. We went to couples therapy to work through the guilt we both felt about not recognizing Mr. Brennan's predatory behavior sooner. Our therapist helped us understand that predators are experts at deception and that we'd responded appropriately once we discovered what was happening. 10 years after the original conviction, Olivia worked as a child psychologist specializing in trauma recovery. She'd helped dozens of young people process experiences similar to her own and advocated nationally for stronger protections in schools. She'd written a book about her experience that became required reading in education programs across the country. She'd married someone who understood her history and supported her advocacy work. She'd built a life defined by resilience and purpose rather than by what had been done to her. Mr. Brennan was still in prison serving his combined 35-year sentence and would likely die behind bars. The school district implemented every reform we'd demanded and more. They hired independent consultants to review all personnel and identify potential problems before they escalated. They created an anonymous reporting system where students and parents could raise concerns without fear of retaliation. They brought in experts to train staff annually on recognizing and responding to grooming behaviors. They established a victim advocate position to support families navigating investigations and legal processes. None of this would bring back the years of innocence Mr. Brennan had stolen from his victims, but it created barriers to prevent future predators from succeeding. I thought often about the 6 audio recordings that Olivia had created at age 11. That evidence had been crucial in convicting Mr. Brennan and validating other victims who came forward later. If she hadn't been brave enough to document what was happening, Mr. Brennan might have successfully assaulted her and continued preying on students for years. Her courage had protected not only herself, but countless other children who would have become his targets. That realization helped ease some of the guilt I carried about not recognizing the danger sooner. The media attention around Mr. Brennan's case sparked national conversations about predatory teachers and institutional failures to protect students. Other victims around the country began coming forward with their own stories of grooming and abuse by educators. School districts faced increased scrutiny of their hiring and oversight practices. Teachers' unions had to balance protecting members from false accusations with acknowledging that predators did exist within their ranks. The conversation was uncomfortable and necessary, forcing educational institutions to confront failures they'd preferred to ignore. Olivia spoke at a national conference on child safety in schools. She stood in front of hundreds of educators, administrators, and advocates and told her story with remarkable composure. She described how Mr. Brennan had exploited his position of authority to manipulate her and how she'd lived in fear for months before finding the courage to document his behavior. She challenged the audience to examine their own practices and honestly assess whether they were doing enough to protect students. She said every school had a responsibility to create environments where children felt safe reporting concerns and where adults took those concerns seriously every single time. Her presentation received a standing ovation, and dozens of people approached her afterward to share their own stories or thank her for her courage. Several administrators admitted they'd dismissed complaints about teachers in the past and now realized they'd failed to protect students. Teachers acknowledged they'd witnessed concerning behaviors from colleagues but hadn't known how to address them. Parents described warning signs they'd missed with their own children. The conversation Olivia started that day rippled outward, changing policies and attitudes in schools across the country. Rachel and I attended every one of Mr. Brennan's parole hearings to ensure he stayed incarcerated. We brought victim impact statements and evidence of ongoing trauma his actions had caused. We presented letters from mental health professionals describing the long-term effects of grooming and betrayal by trusted authority figures. We reminded the parole board that Mr. Brennan had shown no remorse and maintained he'd done nothing wrong. Every time, the board denied parole, and Mr. Brennan remained imprisoned where he couldn't access children. The case fundamentally changed how I viewed authority and institutions. I'd grown up trusting that schools protected children and that systems existed to identify and remove dangerous people. Mr. Brennan's 15-year career of predatory behavior showed how easily those systems failed when institutions prioritized self-protection over student safety. I became deeply skeptical of official assurances and learned to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. I taught Olivia, and later her younger siblings, that challenging authority figures and questioning institutional narratives wasn't disrespectful, but necessary for self-protection. 20 years after Mr. Brennan's conviction, Olivia had a daughter of her own. She approached her child's education with awareness born from painful experience. She volunteered in the classroom regularly and maintained open communication with teachers. She taught her daughter that no adult should ever ask her to keep secrets or make her feel responsible for protecting them. She explained that trustworthy adults respect boundaries and never use their authority to manipulate children. She created the kind of safe, communicative environment she wished she'd had during her own childhood. Mr. Brennan died in prison at age 68, having served 18 years of his sentence. The news reached me through an automated notification system for victims' families. I felt no satisfaction at his death, only a grim acknowledgement that he could never hurt anyone else. I called Olivia to tell her and heard relief in her voice. She said she'd always feared he might somehow be released despite his long sentence. Now that fear could finally rest. We talked about how his death didn't undo the trauma he'd caused, but did represent a final ending to that chapter of our lives. The reforms we'd fought for had become standard practice in schools nationwide. Teacher background checks included direct conversations with former employers who were required by law to disclose disciplinary actions and complaints. Grooming behavior training was mandatory for all school staff and updated annually. Independent oversight committees reviewed complaints and ensured they were investigated thoroughly. Anonymous reporting systems allowed students and parents to raise concerns without fear. These changes didn't eliminate predatory teachers entirely, but they made it much harder for them to operate undetected for years. Olivia published her second book examining institutional failures that enable predators across multiple sectors, including schools, churches, and youth organizations. She argued that institutions consistently prioritized reputation and liability over victim protection. She documented patterns of minimizing complaints, pressuring families to stay quiet, and moving problem employees rather than firing them. She proposed structural reforms that would shift legal liability to administrators who failed to act on warnings. The book became influential in policy circles and contributed to legislative changes in multiple states. Looking back on those early recordings Olivia made at age 11, I remained in awe of her courage and presence of mind. She'd recognized something was wrong and had the intelligence to document it, even while feeling scared and confused. That evidence had been the foundation for everything that followed. Mr. Brennan's conviction, the civil lawsuit, the policy reforms, and the validation of other victims. Without those recordings, it would have been her word against a respected teacher with 15 years of experience. The case might never have been prosecuted successfully. Olivia's bravery had created accountability where institutional systems had failed. The question of what kind of teacher should never be allowed near children had a clear answer. Teachers who groom, manipulate, and prey on the vulnerability and trust of students in their care. Teachers who use their authority to break down boundaries and normalize inappropriate attention. Teachers who make children feel responsible for keeping secrets and maintaining relationships that exist in isolation from parents and peers. Mr. Brennan had been exactly that kind of teacher, and the systems meant to protect children had failed repeatedly to stop him until Olivia found the courage to create evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Her recordings had saved not just herself, but countless other potential victims from a predator who'd spent years perfecting his methods. I sat in my office 25 years after finding those first recordings and looked at a photo on my desk. Olivia stood with her daughter in front of the advocacy center we'd helped establish after the trial. The center provided support for families navigating abuse cases and trained professionals on recognizing predatory behaviors. It existed because of Olivia's courage and because we'd refused to let institutional failures go unchallenged. Mr. Brennan had taken months of our daughter's childhood and had left scars that would never fully heal. But Olivia had transformed that trauma into a force for protecting others, proving that predators don't get the final word on their victims' stories. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.